Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to a quiet world, just after the thunder of war, where the air still trembles with what has been lost. Imagine the hush that follows distant guns, the soft drift of smoke over fields that once sang with courage. In that silence, something new begins to stir. A mystery of the human mind waiting to be understood. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe, just if this brought you peace of mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. It began, as so many great tragedies do, with confidence. In the summer of 1914, Europe drifted into war with the unhurried certainty of a society convinced of its own progress. Steam engines puffed, electric lights glowed, and men who wore pocket watches believed that time itself was marching forward toward an inevitable triumph of reason. The future, everyone agreed, would be brighter, faster, and cleaner, perhaps a little noisy, but nothing that could not be managed with sufficient industry and moral fiber. When the armies first mobilized, it was with brass bands and flowers. Soldiers paraded through the streets of London, Paris, and Berlin, cheered by crowds who threw confetti and waved flags. Officers tipped their hats and promised to be home by Christmas. It all seemed so tidy. A century of colonial campaigns had taught Europeans that wars were brisk affairs, settled quickly by courage, discipline, and the occasional cavalry charge. No one, at least not among the confident men in charge, imagined that the very structure of the human mind would soon begin to fracture under the weight of modern warfare. The first weeks of battle were chaotic, but recognizable. Lines of infantry, mounted scouts, the old rhythms of maneuver and retreat. But as the fronts stabilized and the trenches appeared, the shape of war itself began to change. The landscape of Europe hardened into an industrial machine for producing death on an unprecedented scale. The ground was clawed open, not by farmers but by artillery. Men lived in the mud, shoulder to shoulder with rats and fear. And above them, the sky never truly quieted. Artillery was the defining sound of the new age. It hummed and thundered like the mechanical heart of a world gone mad. Even when the guns paused, they left behind a phantom vibration that seemed to live in the bones. The human nervous system, which had evolved to respond to sudden threats, was not built for continuous trembling. The constant bombardment worked on the mind the way waves work on a cliff, slowly, patiently, until something gives way. Doctors at the front noticed it first. A soldier would arrive at a casualty clearing station with trembling hands. He had no visible wounds, yet he could not stop shaking. Others stammered, blinked uncontrollably, or seemed lost in a fog. Some were deaf, though their ears were intact. Some were blind, though their eyes looked perfectly healthy. One day a man would speak clearly. The next he could not utter a sound. When ordered back to the line, many collapsed or wept. The symptoms varied wildly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Something invisible was breaking. In the early months, the medical officers tried to fit these strange cases into familiar categories. The vocabulary of the 19th century was still their guide. A nervous breakdown was the province of the sensitive or the idle. Women had hysteria, gentlemen had neurasthenia, a fashionable exhaustion of the nerves, often cured with fresh air and a brisk walk in the Alps. But this, whatever it was, did not fit the old template. These were not pale poets or overworked clerks. These were farmhands, miners, shopkeepers, men who until recently had seemed entirely ordinary. It was Captain Charles Samuel Myers, a Cambridge psychologist serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps, who first gave the condition a name. In February of 1915, he published a short article in The Lancet describing 3 soldiers who had been near exploding shells and who subsequently developed paralysis, loss of memory, and trembling. He called their condition shell shock. The term was simple and vivid, and it spread through the ranks faster than any medical paper ever had. It suggested a physical cause, a shock to the nervous system produced by the force of the blast. It made intuitive sense. The explosion had rattled the man's brain, much as a dropped clock might lose its rhythm. The military hierarchy, always happier with mechanical explanations than with moral ones, accepted the idea at first. A man shaken by an explosion was still a man of courage. He was a casualty, not a coward. But the simplicity of the diagnosis did not last. Soon doctors began seeing men with identical symptoms who had never been near an exploding shell. They had simply endured too many months of fear. The shock, it seemed, could be produced by terror alone. This realization was deeply unsettling. If the mind could break from fear, then courage, perhaps the single most prized quality in a soldier, was not a fixed trait, but a fragile state, one that could fail through no fault of will. The generals, as a rule, were not thrilled by this possibility. They preferred explanations that did not implicate the structure of the war itself. A few sympathetic officers saw the suffering for what it was, but many others dismissed it as malingering. The British High Command fretted that if soldiers learned they could escape the front by trembling, the trenches would empty overnight, and so the diagnosis of shell shock, once a mark of medical curiosity, became politically inconvenient. The army could not fight a war if the mind was declared vulnerable to it. Treatment, such as it was, varied with the doctor's temperament. Some physicians believed in rest and reassurance. Others preferred what they call disciplinary therapy, which often involved electric currents applied to the patient's throat or limbs. The goal was to startle the nervous system back into obedience. Men who could not speak were jolted until they could, or at least until they screamed. Official reports later described these sessions as curative, though one suspects the cure had more to do with fear of the doctor than recovery of the nerves. Among the more enlightened figures was Waddy Ochar Rivers, another Cambridge scholar turned army doctor. He was stationed at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, a place that would become famous not for its treatments, but for the minds it sheltered. Rivers believed that the symptoms of shell shock were not signs of weakness, but of the mind's attempt to protect itself. A man who trembled or forgot might simply be trying unconsciously to keep unbearable memories from surfacing. Rivers did not punish his patients. He listened to them. In that quiet, he began to discover the outlines of what we now call trauma. It said Craiglockhart that 2 young officers, both poets, met under Rivers's care. Siegfried Sassoon, already celebrated for his bravery and his bitterness, had been sent there after publicly declaring that the war was being needlessly prolonged. The army preferred to label him insane rather than treasonous. The other was Wilfred Owen, gentle, stammering, haunted by what he had seen in the trenches. Their meeting would change English literature and perhaps our entire vocabulary for describing the psychological cost of war. Owen had been struggling to find his voice as a poet. Before the war, he had written in the high musical style of the Romantics, All Angels and Light. At Craiglockhart, under Sassoon's mentorship, his writing turned spare and brutal. He began to describe the front as it was, a world of mud and gas and dying cattle. where courage was indistinguishable from endurance. In his poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth, he asked what passing bells tolled for the dead. The answer was none, only the monstrous anger of the guns. Rivers watched these young men write and talk, and he realized that their words were part of their recovery. They were giving shape to what had been shapeless. For a mind broken by noise, the act of naming was a quiet kind of repair. Yet there was irony in it too, because the hospital's ultimate purpose was not to heal these men for peace, but to make them fit for war again. Rivers knew this and disliked it. Still, he carried out his duty with gentle precision, sending patient after patient back to the line. For every poet at Craiglockhart, there were thousands of ordinary soldiers whose suffering remained unrecorded. The scale of shell shock by 1917 had become impossible to ignore. In that year alone, the British Army recorded over 80,000 cases. Other armies faced the same epidemic under different names: Obersight in France, Kriegsnoros in Germany, but the symptoms were nearly identical: tremors, paralysis, mutism, nightmares, and what one officer described as the stare of a man who has seen too much. The stigma, however, was unevenly distributed. An officer might be diagnosed with neurasthenia and sent to a comfortable hospital. A private with the same symptoms could be accused of cowardice. The Army's regulations allowed for execution in such cases, and though later generations would struggle to comprehend it, some men were indeed shot for what we would now recognize as trauma. The records show 336 British soldiers executed for desertion or cowardice during the war, many of them likely victims of shell shock. The logic was grim, but consistent. An example must be made, or discipline would collapse. After the war, families were often told that their sons had died of wounds or fallen in battle, a bureaucratic kindness that concealed a terrible truth. Only decades later did the public begin to reckon with what those euphemisms had hidden. The eventual pardons, issued nearly a century afterward, were a small gesture toward a moral debt that could never really be repaid. The armistice of 1918 brought silence to the front, but it was an uneasy silence. For the men who returned, the noise remained inside. The term shell shock had entered popular speech, but the understanding of it was still shallow. The British government convened a committee to study the problem, and in the usual bureaucratic fashion, concluded that the term itself should be abolished. It was too vague, too emotive, and perhaps most dangerously, too sympathetic. Instead, doctors were encouraged to use phrases like war neurosis or neurasthenia. The language retreated just as the need for understanding grew. In homes across Britain and Europe, wives and parents tried to make sense of the men who had come back changed. They were quiet, or angry, or both. They woke in the night, shouting. They drank too much. They avoided loud noises and crowded rooms. They rarely spoke of what they had seen. And when they did, their listeners often wished they had not. Society, eager to move on, rewarded silence. Medals were polished, parades held, and then the subject of the war quietly shifted to the past tense. The veterans, many of them still shaking, were left to figure out what had happened to their mind. The Ministry of Pensions, which handled claims for disabled soldiers, faced an overwhelming number of applications. Physical injuries could be measured. Missing limbs were unambiguous. Psychological wounds were another matter. Officials often suspected fraud. A man who claimed to tremble might simply be unsteady from drink. A stammer might be an act, The result was a system that demanded proof of suffering but refused to believe it when shown. Many veterans gave up and vanished into quiet poverty, their trauma reduced to a line item in an accounting ledger. In time, the vocabulary evolved. The Second World War replaced shell shock with battle fatigue, a phrase that suggested temporary exhaustion rather than lasting damage. Later still, in the Vietnam era, psychiatrists adopted a new term, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was, in essence, the same wound that Charles Myers had described in 1915, dressed in modern clinical clothing. But the path from the trenches to the textbooks was long and uneven, paved with misunderstanding, shame, and bureaucracy. The irony of shell shock is that it forced the modern world to rediscover something ancient, the vulnerability of the human spirit. The same civilization that had invented machine guns and airplanes had somehow forgotten that fear could break a person. The industrial age had promised mastery over nature, but it had not prepared the mind for the sound of its own inventions. The soldiers of 1914 marched to war, believing themselves heirs to empire and progress. What they found instead was the limits of endurance, and the beginning of a conversation about trauma that would take the rest of the century to complete. And so, as the guns fell silent and the smoke drifted away, the real battle moved inward. The mind, once thought to be a fortress of reason and will, revealed itself to be a landscape just as fragile and war-torn as the fields of Flanders. The men who returned carried that landscape within them, unseen but unending. In the quiet years that followed the war, doctors, philosophers, and poets tried, each in their own way, to make sense of what had happened. Europe was a continent of mourning. The statistics alone were impossible to digest. Millions dead, millions more injured, and an entire generation left with memories that would not stay buried. The visible wounds could be shown in parades or on medals, but the invisible ones lingered behind closed doors. It was the age of the haunted man. Hospitals filled with veterans who had never quite returned from the front. Their symptoms seemed to defy ordinary categories. A man who had been paralyzed during the war sometimes stood up and walked when startled. Another, deaf since an explosion, might turn his head when his name was whispered. For every physical explanation that seemed to fit, another case contradicted it. The boundaries between mind and body blurred, and medical science, so proud of its new machines and instruments, found itself baffled by an affliction that left no trace on an X-ray. The psychological sciences were still young. Sigmund Freud had published his earliest work on hysteria and repression only a few decades earlier, and many physicians viewed such ideas with suspicion. The British medical establishment in particular clung to the older, more mechanical view of illness. If something was wrong, there had to be a lesion, a scar, or a measurable imbalance. The idea that memory itself could be a wound felt uncomfortably abstract, but the evidence was mounting, and the doctors who had seen the war up close could not ignore it. One of those doctors, H.R. Rivers, continued his work after leaving Craiglockhart. He had been a physiologist and anthropologist before the war, studying the kinship patterns of South Pacific Islanders. It was perhaps this outsider's perspective that made him so adept at recognizing the cultural conditioning behind the British concept of courage. He understood that the stiff upper lip was not a universal law of human behavior, but a social script. When men trained in that script found themselves in the unscripted horror of trench warfare, their minds had nowhere safe to retreat. His approach, calm, conversational, almost fatherly, was revolutionary for its time. Rivers encouraged patients to speak freely about their experiences, though in a manner so understated it might not seem like therapy at all. He called it the talking cure, borrowing the phrase from Freud's circle, but stripping it of continental flamboyance. To Rivers, the goal was still to help a man reconcile his sense of duty with his sense of horror. The conflict between those two forces, he believed, was what broke the mind. Not everyone agreed. In other hospitals, the treatments remained harsh. Electric shocks were administered to stimulate paralyzed limbs or to discipline mutism. Hydrotherapy, another favorite of the era, involved cold baths, wet sheets, or the alternation of scalding and freezing water. The reasoning was that the nervous system could be jolted back into normal function through discomfort. Many patients, unsurprisingly, showed temporary compliance. The official statistics reported impressive recovery rates. The reality was quieter and less triumphant. A man could be trained to speak under electric current, but his silence, once learned, often returned in the night. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms of Britain, the conversation about masculinity was shifting, though few would admit it. The Victorian ideal of the unflinching gentleman, stoic, rational, morally upright, had sustained the empire for a century. But the war had exposed the limits of that model. The soldiers who came home trembling were still men of courage, yet their existence suggested that courage was not a shield against suffering. The public did not quite know what to do with that fact. Some preferred not to think about it at all. Governments, too, had an interest in forgetting. The Ministry of Pensions faced hundreds of thousands of claims for psychological injuries. It was expensive business, compensating invisible wounds. The bureaucrats developed elaborate categories to manage the flood. A man might be labeled with disordered action of the heart, a convenient term that placed his distress in the chest rather than the mind. Others were assigned neurasthenia, a diagnosis vague enough to cover nearly anything but specific enough to be denied. The guiding principle was economy, not empathy. Yet, despite the institutional resistance, a quiet transformation was taking place in the intellectual world. The Great War had given psychologists and neurologists an enormous, unwilling laboratory. Thousands of cases meant thousands of data points. Researchers across Europe began to map the relationship between fear, memory, and the body's reflexes. The language of shell shock gradually gave way to the broader concept of trauma, a term that could describe both physical and emotional injury. The idea was still controversial, but the seed had been planted. In Germany, where the war's aftermath was even more chaotic, the discussion took on a darker tone. The new Weimar Republic inherited a nation full of veterans with shattered nerves and a bankrupt economy that could not support them. The medical community split into two camps: those who advocated for compassionate care and those who viewed psychological injury as a moral failing. Courts were flooded with pension appeal. Some doctors testified on behalf of the veterans. Others were hired by the government to argue that these men were merely weak or degenerate. The same pattern repeated across Europe: a war fought in the trenches, followed by a smaller bureaucratic war fought in offices. Back in Britain, the popular image of the shell-shock soldier began to appear in art and literature. Plays and novels depicted haunted veterans drifting through polite society, unable to connect with those who had stayed home. The silent, trembling man became a symbol of modern disillusionment. He was, in a way, the mirror image of the confident Edwardian gentleman who had marched off to war in 1914. The empire that had once prided itself on reason and composure was now populated by men who flinched at sudden sounds. Among those who tried to capture this change was Siegfried Sassoon. After his time at Craiglockhart, He returned briefly to the front, more out of loyalty to his men than to the war itself. He survived, though many of his friends did not. His post-war poems dripped with irony and restrained anger. And does it matter, he asked, almost casually, whether it truly mattered if one lost one's legs or sight, since there would always be cheerful people ready to reassure the wounded that it did not. His tone was flat, nearly conversational, but behind the dryness lay a profound bitterness. Wilfred Owen, the younger poet he had mentored, was less sardonic and more sorrowful. Owen returned to France in 1918, despite his fragile recovery, believing he must share the fate of his comrades. He was killed 1 week before the armistice. His parents received the telegram as church bells rang to celebrate peace. When his poems were published after his death, they became the voice of a generation. Owen's verses did not glorify courage or victory. They mourned the loss of innocence, the collapse of faith, and the quiet endurance of fear. The war poets and the shell-shocked soldiers belonged to the same emotional world. Both had been undone by an experience too large for the language available to describe it. Their words, when they found them, became a kind of therapy for the culture itself. The steady rhythms of Owen's verse, the detached irony of Sassoon's, even the melancholy humor of later writers, all of them reflected a collective attempt to process trauma. As the 1920s drifted into the 1930s, the world's attention shifted elsewhere. Economies faltered, ideologies hardened, and a new generation began to prepare for another war. As if the last one had not been sufficient education, the doctors who had studied shell shock moved on to new titles: combat exhaustion, war neurosis, operational fatigue. The vocabulary changed, but the human experience did not. The Second World War repeated the cycle almost perfectly. Men fought, broke, and were told to rest briefly before returning to the fight. The PIE principles, proximity, immediacy, and expectancy, became military doctrine. Treat them near the front, treat them fast, and expect recovery. It was, in essence, a bureaucratic way of saying, we need you back as soon as possible. Still, there was progress. By mid-century, psychiatry had gained enough legitimacy to influence policy. The concept of trauma began to extend beyond soldiers. Civilians who had survived bombings or concentration camps displayed similar symptoms: nightmares, flashbacks, detachment. The invisible wounds of war were no longer confined to the battlefield. Humanity, it seemed, had discovered a universal condition: the nervous system's rebellion against horror. The irony of it all, of course, was that the modern world continued to produce new reasons for the mind to revolt. The industrialized wars of the 20th century were followed by smaller but equally brutal conflicts. Each one generated its own vocabulary of distress, and each one brought the old lessons back into focus. But the first step on that long road, the recognition that fear could wound as deeply as shrapnel, belonged to the soldiers of 1914. If you wander through the old cemeteries of Europe, you can still find their names carved into stone with a kind of resigned neatness. Many have no known grave. Their minds, perhaps more than their bodies, became the battlefield's final casualties. The phrases we use today, post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, combat fatigue, are polite descendants of a word that began as a guess in a medical journal, shell shock. And even now, more than a century later, the term carries a strange resonance. It speaks not only of the physical blast, but of the human tendency to be startled by its own capacity for violence. The sound of the guns may have faded, but the echo remains, soft and persistent, somewhere in the collective nervous system of the modern world. If the years after the First World War were filled with uneasy silence, the decades that followed learned how to make that silence look respectable. Veterans' hospitals became part of the urban landscape, quiet, red brick institutions on the edges of cities where the corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and loss. The men inside were officially being rehabilitated, a word that implied progress but rarely described what was actually happening. Many were simply waiting, their lives suspended between the noise of the past and the indifference of the present. Their families, too, developed strategies for endurance. A wife might learn to move softly around a husband who startled at footsteps. Children discovered that certain questions, "What was it like? Did you see anyone die?" were not to be asked. Dinner tables became rituals of cautious small talk. The newspapers called these men heroes, but at home they were simply unpredictable. One could never tell whether a slammed door would be met with silence or with rage. In polite society, such things were not discussed. The vocabulary of trauma had not yet entered domestic life, so the unspoken rule was that one kept going. Governments reinforced the same message. Across Europe and the Commonwealth, parades celebrated victory, not aftermath. The official story was one of resilience, a tidy narrative that left little room for the inconvenient detail that millions of survivors were broken in ways invisible to medals. When pensions were mentioned, it was in the language of charity, not responsibility. The state had done what it could. The reasoning went, the rest was up to the individual's moral fiber, a phrase that could mean almost anything, and usually did. The early 1930s brought economic depression, and with it, another kind of nervous exhaustion. The fragile peace of Europe began to crack. Old resentments stirred, new leaders promised renewal, and once again the machinery of nationalism began to hum. It was almost impressive, in a morbid way, how efficiently the lessons of the previous war were forgotten. The generation that had lived through the trenches was now middle-aged, and many of them watched the new enthusiasm for rearmament with quiet disbelief. They had seen this play before, and they knew the ending. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, military medicine was at least somewhat better prepared. Shell shock was not officially recognized. The term had been banned from British reports in 1930. But its ghost haunted the medical manuals. This time, psychiatrists were deployed alongside surgeons. The US Army adopted a pragmatic doctrine. Combat stress could be treated quickly and near the front, before the soldier identified too strongly as a patient. This was the famous PIE method: proximity, immediacy, expectancy. Treat him close to his unit, treat him at once, and assure him that he will soon return to duty. The method worked, in a narrow sense. Many men did return to the line, though often with the same haunted stare that had puzzled their predecessors in France. The goal was not healing, but functionality. A soldier who could stand and shoot again was considered recovered. The psychological toll was simply deferred. After the war, the same men would find themselves waking in the night, soaked in sweat, decades before anyone thought to call it post-traumatic stress. On the home front, civilians were no longer spared from trauma. The Blitz turned entire neighborhoods into experiments in endurance. Families slept in basements and subway tunnels, while bombs fell overhead. Learning that fear, like the weather, could become a normal part of life, the government issued pamphlets about morale, encouraging citizens to stay calm and carry on, a phrase now printed on coffee mugs. But born of genuine desperation, the stoic mask became national policy. When it slipped, as it inevitably did, People explained the trembling as nerves or tiredness. The word trauma still belonged to soldiers, not civilians. By 1945, the world had expanded its understanding of what fear could do to the human mind, though it was still reluctant to admit it. Psychiatrists studying prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, and bombed-out cities began to notice common patterns: insomnia, nightmares, sudden bursts of anger, emotional numbness. These symptoms appeared in people who had never fired a shot. Trauma, it seemed, was democratic. It cared little for uniforms. The recognition of this fact was slow and politically inconvenient. Nations emerging from total war preferred stories of rebuilding and unity to dwell on psychological wounds, felt defeatist. In Britain, the term battle exhaustion replaced shell shock, as if weariness were the only issue. In the United States, combat fatigue sounded similarly temporary, like something a good rest might fix. Soldiers were told they would recover. Many believed it, until they realized the war was over and the rest never came. The late 1940s and 1950s produced a peculiar cultural contradiction. On one hand, the world was fascinated by psychiatry. Books and films explored the mysteries of the mind, and suburban dinner parties included talk of neuroses with a faint air of sophistication. On the other hand, those who actually suffered psychological injury from the war found little compassion. Therapy was a middle-class novelty, not a public service. The veterans who sought help were often met with puzzled indifference. Their symptoms did not fit neatly into the optimism of the post-war boom. In the Soviet Union and much of Eastern Europe, the subject of psychological trauma was suppressed almost entirely. Official ideology insisted that the heroic citizen of socialism could not be broken by fear. Those who showed signs of distress were treated as politically suspect, a policy that did wonders for national denial, but little for public health. The state preferred monuments to therapy, stone soldiers with unblinking eyes, carved in perfect confidence. In the West, research continued in small, cautious circles. Military psychiatrists studied the long-term effects of combat on veterans, often using language that carefully avoided emotion. Reports spoke of residual anxiety states or chronic adjustment difficulties. It all sounded tidy, almost bureaucratic, as if the human soul were an administrative problem awaiting better filing system. Yet buried in those reports were observations that would later define modern trauma theory. The idea that time does not heal all wounds, that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and that silence can be its own form of suffering. Then came Vietnam. For the United States, it was a conflict fought not just abroad, but in the national psyche. The war dragged on through the 1960s and early 1970s, televised and disputed in real time. Soldiers returned to a country divided and unwelcoming. Unlike their fathers who had come home from the good war, these veterans were met with ambivalence, even hostility. Many withdrew from public life. Some joined protest movements. Others simply disappeared into rural towns and city alleys, carrying a quiet burden that no one wished to name. Psychiatrists began to notice that the pattern looked eerily familiar. Flashbacks, hypervigilance, guilt, emotional detachment, symptoms identical to those described by Charles Myers in 1915. Only the jungle had replaced the trench. The term post-Vietnam syndrome emerged, a placeholder until the profession could agree on something more formal. By 1980, the American Psychiatric Association adopted a new diagnostic category, post-traumatic stress disorder. The invisible wound of 1914 finally had an official neutral name, It was, in a way, the long echo of shell shock finding its modern frequency. The DSM-3's definition described a person exposed to a life-threatening event who then re-experienced it through nightmares and intrusive memories, avoided reminders of it, and lived in a state of heightened arousal. Behind the clinical phrasing lay the same old truth that the mind, when pushed beyond its limits, sometimes cannot find its way back. For historians, the new terminology offered closure. Shell shock had evolved into PTSD, a tidy narrative of progress. Yet the veterans themselves might have found the continuity less reassuring. Names change more easily than pain does. Whether in Flanders or in Vietnam, the experience was much the same. The sense that the world had shattered, and that one's own body had become the battlefield's last prisoner. Modern militaries adopted mental health programs, counseling services, and stress management courses. Recruits were told that acknowledging fear was part of professionalism, not weakness. It was a noble shift, though one that often ran headlong into the same old culture of stoicism. A century after the first trembling soldiers appeared in casualty stations, the armed forces were still learning to accept that bravery and vulnerability could occupy the same uniform. In civilian life, the vocabulary of trauma spread even further. The concept once reserved for soldiers began to describe survivors of accidents, disasters, and abuse. It was as if the invisible wound of the Great War had quietly become humanity's shared inheritance. News anchors spoke of communities being traumatized. Self-help books promised recovery. The language of shell shock had at last entered ordinary speech, diluted, perhaps, but alive. Even so, one can still sense the faint unease that accompanies any discussion of psychological injury. The modern world is comfortable with data and technology, less so with the reminder that progress has not eliminated fragility. We still flinch at sudden noises. We still dream of falling. The nervous system, it turns out, is a conservative institution. It remembers, and somewhere beneath the digital calm of the 21st century, the same slow echo continues. The echo of artillery that once rolled across Europe and into the collective mind. The guns have fallen silent, but their memory hums softly on, like a distant storm just beyond hearing, reminding us that history does not end when the shooting stops. In the decades after the formal recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, people began to understand that the story of shell shock was not just a military footnote, but a map of how modern civilization came to terms with fear itself. By the late 20th century, the medical textbooks had caught up with what poets and soldiers had known all along, that terror leaves fingerprints not only on the memory, but on the body. Still, even as scientists recorded electrical patterns in the brain, the public conversation moved with its usual lagging grace. Society preferred to believe that trauma could be processed like paperwork, filed neatly away with a diagnosis and a treatment plan. Modern neuroscience confirmed what early observers like Rivers had sensed intuitively. Fear is not just an emotion, but a physiological process. The brain stores experiences of danger in the amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster that decides rather rudely when to panic. In a normal life, the system resets after the threat passes. In war, the reset never comes. The mind stays on alert, looping through its alarms as if the shell fire might resume at any moment. That constant vigilance, once vital for survival, becomes exhausting in peace. It is the same ancient defense mechanism that allowed our ancestors to leap from predators, now misapplied to door slams and car backfires. The late 20th century had a particular fondness for acronyms. PTSD was joined by CPTSD, C standing for complex, a polite way of saying that repeated exposure to distress leaves deeper grooves in the mind than one-time shock. Governments funded studies, and the language of therapy drifted into popular culture. Films and television began to use the term casually, sometimes earnestly, sometimes as shorthand for character depth. A once taboo subject became fashionable, though still imperfectly understood. By the time researchers mapped these reactions with brain scans, the soldiers of the Great War were long gone, their stories yellowed into archives, yet their legacy shaped every step of that scientific progress. The term shell shock, quaint and archaic as it sounded, lingered as a metaphor for any overwhelming experience. Journalists used it to describe election losses or stock market crashes, perhaps unaware that the phrase was born among men who could not hold a spoon without trembling. Language evolves, but memory leaves residue. Meanwhile, the descendants of those first victims, the veterans of later wars, kept discovering how stubborn trauma could be. In the Persian Gulf, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, reports of nervous collapse, hypervigilance, and depression echoed the same old patterns. The tools for treatment were more humane: therapy, medication, support groups. But the cultural hesitation remained. Admitting distress still felt risky in professions built on discipline. The paradox that had haunted 1916 persisted into the 21st century. To acknowledge fear is to prove one's humanity, yet to survive combat often requires suppressing it entirely. Civilians joined the conversation too. After natural disasters, plane crashes, and acts of terror, counselors spoke of community trauma. The once specialized language of psychiatry became public vocabulary. People who had never heard of Charles Myers or Craig Lockhart began to use words like trigger and flashback. Some felt this democratization cheapened the experience of war veterans. Others saw it as overdue empathy. Either way, the invisible wound had finally lost its exclusivity. It belonged to anyone who had ever faced helplessness and lived to remember it. By the new millennium, scholars began to link the concept of trauma to literature, art, and politics. The term spread into discussions of colonialism, slavery, and genocide. It became a way to describe entire societies reacting to historical catastrophe. In this broadened view, the soldiers of 1914 were simply the first large-scale example of a human pattern. When systems of belief collapse, minds fracture to accommodate the new reality. The trenches were the birthplace of modern disillusionment. From there, the mood seeped into everything: the novels of the lost generation, the modernist experiments in art, even the dry irony that would come to define 20th century humor. Shell shock had become cultural rather than medical. Even architecture carried traces of that shift. The memorials built in the 1920s and 1930s favored abstraction over glory. Endless rows of white stones, blank walls etched with names. The designers rarely mentioned psychology, but their work reflected it. These were not monuments to victory, but to endurance. The silence of those cemeteries is not accidental. It mirrors the quiet inside the minds of the living, who could not speak of what they had seen. In universities, historians revisited the First World War with new eyes. The old emphasis on tactics and strategy gave way to studies of morale, psychology, and culture. The letters of soldiers, the diaries of nurses, the medical case files all became evidence of a collective nervous breakdown. The historian's tone was often clinical but quietly mournful. One could sense beneath the statistics the echo of all those unnamed men who shook, stammered, or fell silent in the mud. The war, it turned out, had not only redrawn borders, it had redrawn the boundaries of what counted as injury. And yet, amid the abstractions, there remains something very simple and stubborn: individual suffering. The same trembling hands, the same 1,000-yard stare. In museum exhibits dedicated to the Great War, one sometimes finds a looping film of a soldier in a hospital bed, his body shaking uncontrollably as doctors watch. The image is grainy, black, and white, distant enough to feel unreal. Viewers stand silently, unsure whether to look away or to keep watching. That flicker of discomfort is the inheritance of every generation that benefits from someone else's endurance. What makes the story of shell shock both tragic and oddly comforting is that it forced modern society to recognize fragility as a universal constant. Before 1914, Western civilization imagined itself armored in progress, protected by science, empire, and reason. The war stripped that illusion bare. It revealed that the human nervous system, despite centuries of culture and invention, still reacts like that of any frightened animal. The great industrial empires could build dreadnoughts and machine guns, but they could not build a brain impervious to fear. Science offers hope, but not magic. Cognitive therapies can help veterans retrain their responses, teaching the brain to distinguish between past and present. Medications can dampen the chemical storms that accompany anxiety, but even the best treatment acknowledges a truth that rivers might have whispered a century ago. Healing does not erase memory, it teaches one how to live beside it. The goal is not to forget the noise, but to lower its volume. The irony deepened as technology advanced. Each new invention promised efficiency, precision, and distance from danger. Drones, satellites, guided missiles, all designed to make warfare cleaner. Yet the soldiers who guided them from control rooms often reported the same disorientation as those who had once crouched in trenches. Watching destruction unfold on a screen carried its own quiet torment. The body might be safe, but the mind still felt the shock. By the early 21st century, the phrase shell shock had mostly vanished from medical vocabulary, yet it persisted in everyday speech, a kind of ghostly shorthand for any overwhelming surprise. People described markets, sports teams, and celebrity scandals as shell-shocking, often unaware that the term's origins lay in hospital wards, filled with trembling men who could barely speak. Words have a way of forgetting their own pain, though the echo of it remains. And so, more than a century after Charles Myers coined his simple phrase, humanity continues to circle the same lesson. Progress does not cancel vulnerability, it only changes its form. The guns of Flanders are silent, but the echoes migrate through new generations, new conflicts, and new vocabularies. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Great War, that it forced us to listen to the sound of what cannot be repaired, and to keep listening, softly, even when the world prefers sleep. Still, historians, psychologists, and descendants of the Great War's veterans continued to trace the thread backward, wondering how a single phrase could contain so much of modern history's unease. It is strange to think that a war fought with biplanes and horses laid the groundwork for how the 21st century understands anxiety, trauma, and memory. Yet it did, quietly, in those first hospitals behind the front lines where bewildered doctors confronted an ailment no textbook could explain. In the archives of the Royal Army Medical Corps, one can still find the case notes, yellowing pages filled with observans written in careful, cursive ink. Patient trembles continuously, one reads. Cannot recall his regiment's position during bombardment. Claims to see flashes when eyes are closed. Another report notes, speech absent since July, responds to commands with gestures, pulse irregular. There is something hauntingly bureaucratic about these descriptions. The handwriting is neat, the tone detached, the emotion that the doctors could not acknowledge bled into their precision. Many of the men described in those files were, in effect, the first recorded witnesses of what we now call psychological trauma. Their experiences reshaped both medicine and morality. Before them, fear was a matter of willpower. After them, it became a question of neurochemistry. The shift did not happen overnight. It took decades of research, argument, and reluctant empathy to transform cultural judgment into clinical understanding. But once it happened, it changed everything, from how armies trained soldiers to how therapists listened to their patients. Of course, society did not arrive at this understanding gracefully. Every generation had to rediscover the same truth under a new name. The veterans of World War I were called shell-shocked. Those of World War II suffered battle exhaustion. The soldiers of Korea and Vietnam had combat fatigue or post-Vietnam syndrome. Each phrase carried a hint of embarrassment, as if the language itself were apologizing for having to describe weakness. Only with the adoption of PTSD did the stigma begin to ease, and even then, only slightly. All of it, in one way or another, traced back to the noise of that first modern war, when millions of men experienced the limits of endurance. Civilization itself lost its innocence. The old assurances about honor, faith, and progress no longer felt convincing. The mind had joined the body as something that could be wounded by history. The recognition of trauma also transformed art. Between the wars, painters and writers abandoned the smooth surfaces of realism. They fractured their compositions, blurred time, and distorted perspective. The modernist movement, with all its angular strangeness, can be read as a collective attempt to express the inner disarray that shell shock had revealed. Comtes Elouet's poetry, with its fragmented voices and haunted repetition, sounded like the echoing mind of a soldier who had seen too much. In music, composers such as Ravel and Stravinsky broke from traditional harmony, their rhythms pulsing with mechanical precision and sudden violence. The sonic memory of artillery, even architecture, once so confident in its symmetry, began to favor concrete, minimalism, and silence. In a sense, the legacy of shell shock is both tragic and strangely hopeful. It reminds us that even the most advanced societies can be undone by their own inventions. Yet it also proves that empathy evolves. The same culture that once executed men for cowardice eventually built programs to counsel them. It took nearly a century, but understanding caught up with experience. Yet there is a curious symmetry in the way the concept evolved. What began as a diagnosis for soldiers eventually expanded to include civilians, then entire societies. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, genocide, terrorism, all demanded a vocabulary for experiences beyond comprehension. Trauma became not just a medical term, but a cultural lens, a way to understand how memory and pain shape identity. The human species, having industrialized destruction, found itself in need of a psychological counterpart, a science of endurance. Still, amid the global discourse and the institutional studies, the individual stories remain small and quiet. The soldier in 1916 who could not stop trembling might have recognized himself in a firefighter from 2001 or a refugee decades later. The setting changes, but the symptoms rhyme: sleeplessness, guilt, detachment, an instinctive flinch at sudden sounds. Time does not erase such patterns. It merely finds new uniforms for them. There is, too, a quiet irony in how science returned to what art and philosophy had intuited long before. Ancient writers spoke of the wounded spirit, or the soul in battle. Shakespeare's Henry IV contains a weary description of sleeplessness after war that could pass for a modern clinical note. The difference is that earlier generations saw such suffering as moral or spiritual. The 20th century, armed with microscopes and data, translated it into chemistry and geology. Progress, perhaps, but not necessarily comfort. In modern military training, recruits learn about mental resilience. They are taught to recognize signs of stress in themselves and others. This is progress of a sort, though it carries its own paradox. To prepare for trauma is still to accept its inevitability. No amount of mindfulness can fully reconcile a mind designed for safety with the experience of organized destruction, and yet soldiers keep learning, doctors keep studying, and history keeps adding new case files to the same old story. If there is one enduring lesson from the saga of shell shock, it may be that civilization's real test is not in how it fights, but in how it listens afterward. The men of 1914 returned home to a world that wanted them to be quiet. Their silence became generational, absorbed by families, passed down through behavior rather than words. Many of their children, raised in the shadow of unspoken fear, carried a vague restlessness of their own. It would take decades before anyone realized that trauma, like inheritance, can skip generations. And perhaps that is why, even today, the story feels unfinished. The name has changed, the science has advanced, but the sound lingers, a low rumble beneath the surface of modern life, in every veteran struggling with reintegration, in every survivor of disaster who cannot sleep, in every descendant who feels a sadness without an origin. The echo of those first explosions persists. It is easy to romanticize the silence after war, to imagine peace as a clean break, a sudden quietness in which the world begins again. But for those who carry the noise inside them, silence is merely another form of echo. The mind keeps replaying the moment until someone listens. That, more than anything, may be the hidden moral of shell shock, that healing begins not with medicine, but with the simple, difficult act of attention. And so, a century after the trenches fell still, the story continues to whisper through our collective consciousness. Every time we speak of trauma, every time we study the brain's response to fear, we are, knowingly or not, answering the same question that puzzled Charles Myers in 1915. How much terror can a human being absorb before something essential begins to break? We have yet to find the limit, though we keep testing it, generation after generation. When the armistice was signed in 1918, the soldiers packed their kit bags and went home, but the war itself stayed with them. A few of those men became public figures, like Siegfried Sassoon, who spent the rest of his life writing about the absurdity of it all. Others disappeared into the countryside, building small, careful lives around their shaking hands and fragile sleep. Their families did what families always do. They adapted. A wife might tell visitors her husband had nerves or that he was not quite himself since France. Children grew up interpreting silence as love, learning to tiptoe around the unspoken. Somewhere, deep beneath the monuments and the textbooks, the story of shell shock hums quietly along. It is not loud history. It does not announce itself with battles or treaties. It lingers instead in letters, diaries, and hospital records, in the way people pause before describing fear, and in the tired expressions of photographs that never made the newspapers. The world likes its wars to end neatly, with a date a victory, a headline. But the human mind doesn't work that way. It ends in echo. The men of the Great War are long gone now, their names carved into stone, and their bodies returned to quiet fields. But the idea they forced the world to confront, that the mind can bleed, remains with us, subtle and persistent. It hums under the surface of daily life like distant thunder, a reminder that progress may make us clever, but never invulnerable. And perhaps that humility, learned the hardest way possible, is the real inheritance of the modern age. By mid-century, that first generation was fading. Many were buried without ever having found words for what happened. Yet their legacy persisted in subtler ways. Their experience seeped into language and culture, reshaping how we talk about pain. Before them, a man who flinched at sudden noise was cowardly. After them, he was ill. It may sound like a small shift, but it was a revolution in empathy. The post-war decades carried this slow evolution forward. The language of nerves softened into the language of stress, and eventually into the vocabulary of psychology that people use without thinking. The everyday expressions on edge, burned out, in shock, all trace back to a time when doctors tried to describe what constant fear does to a body. What began as a medical mystery among soldiers became the grammar of modern life. The world, of course, did not stop giving people reasons to remember those lessons. Wars continued, new weapons arrived, and each generation produced its own version of the haunted soldier. What changed was the response. Instead of punishment or disbelief, there were now clinics, counseling, and research. None of it perfect, but progress rarely is. It was, at least, an acknowledgement that invisible wounds exist. Modern neuroscience continues to circle the same mystery that puzzled Charles Myers. What actually happens inside a mind that cannot bear what it remembers? Scans and data can trace patterns of activity, but they cannot capture the lived experience, the pulse that quickens, the palms that sweat, the way a sound from nowhere can open a door to another time. The scientists have better vocabulary now, amygdala, cortisol, reactivity, but the phenomenon remains the same, the past refusing to stay put. The irony is that, in becoming universal, trauma also became strangely ordinary. The term once reserved for extreme suffering now appears in headlines about losing a sports match or missing a flight. Some scholars worry this dilution robs the word of its gravity. Others argue that it simply proves what shell shock first revealed, that distress is a spectrum, not a competition. What counts as unbearable depends on who is bearing it. By the early 21st century, trauma had become a kind of mirror held up to civilization. Psychologists studied not only veterans, but also refugees, survivors of violence, and even children shaped by second-hand fear. The idea of collective trauma, entire communities affected by shared catastrophe, entered the social sciences. The language born in the trenches of 1914 now described earthquakes, pandemics, and every crisis that left people quietly altered. In the quieter corners of that research, one can still sense the compassion of the old pioneers. H.R. Rivers would recognize himself in the therapists who sit with veterans today, listening more than speaking, giving structure to chaos through conversation. His belief that talking could heal was once considered naive. Now it is mainstream medicine. It turns out that giving memory a narrative helps the brain file it away more safely, like sorting through a cluttered attic to prevent the debris from collapsing under its own weight. Walk through any major war museum, and you can see this evolution displayed without words. Early exhibits show medals and uniforms. Later ones show letters and photographs. The most recent installations play recorded voices of veterans describing nightmares decades after the guns fell silent. The shift from objects to voices mirrors the journey from external to internal history, from glory to understanding. And yet, even with therapy, medication, and understanding, the essential paradox remains. Human beings are designed to remember danger. Forgetting it entirely would be maladaptive. So the goal is balance, to keep the memory without being trapped by it. The story of shell shock is, in that sense, the story of how modern humanity learned to live with its own capacity for horror. If one stands today in the cemeteries of northern France or Belgium, the silence feels almost deliberate. The air seems to hold its breath. The ground beneath is layered with memories, some visible, many not. Beneath the soil lay the men whose minds first carried the invisible scars that modern science would later name. Their stories, once dismissed as weakness, became the blueprint for understanding how the human nervous system endures the unendurable. Perhaps the truest monument to the victims of shell shock is not carved in stone but embedded in everyday compassion. It's in the way people now pause before judging another's reaction, in the quiet recognition that behavior has history behind it. The world that once executed its trembling soldiers now trains medics to comfort them. That is not perfection, but it is progress. The phrase, "the war to end all wars," has long been a sad joke, but perhaps it accomplished something subtler. It ended the illusion that the mind is unbreakable. It forced civilization to look inward and admit that progress without empathy is just another form of violence. And so, more than a century later, the silence after the guns still matters. It is the space in which the world learned to listen, to hear the quiet tremor behind the brave face, to recognize the cost of endurance, and to understand that some battles are fought entirely within. That is the true legacy of shell shock, not the noise of war, but the listening that followed. The slow, careful, imperfect listening that continues even now, wherever someone tries to explain the sound of something that isn't there anymore.